Daniel's very particular about that, so make sure that's done. Hey, people in the audience, we're going to get started in about 5 minutes. So I have Lorna here with me. So if you'd like to put in the chat where you are chatting from and maybe a win you had this week as well. So we start off on a very, very positive note. And we'll just let everyone filter in. What's the weather like there, Lorna?
It's getting beautiful and sunny. I'm so excited. It's the best time. The weather here in Ibiza is just amazing in May, and then it's also amazing in October. So my two favorite times to be here on the island are spring and fall, especially before all the tourists come over and then after all the tourists leave.
Of course. Yeah.
And normally, if it wasn't a pandemic year, there would be like the opening parties and the closing parties, and it's just all really fun. But this has been a much more quiet year because of pandemic, and a good time to enjoy the nature, much more so since there aren't a lot of people.
Yeah, I am so jealous, by the way. That's where I want to go in the after times to get all the like partying out I didn't do during the pandemic. It's definitely where you are right now. So
yeah, it's a good spot for sure.
Yeah. Is that where the full moon parties are as well? Ibiza, or is that
They used to have full moon parties here, and apparently, so then there was this like crackdown, right? So there was kind of like the simultaneous nightclub mob, and police, collusion, where essentially the open air parties that, were the free hippie parties, like anybody could celebrate and gather, those started to get shut down in order to favor the big expensive clubs. And so that kind of became a total pain. That was a big shift away from some of the free-spirited aspects of Ibiza to something that's looking a lot more like elite club culture, so to speak. And a lot of the old school hippies are very disappointed by that transition.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, we see that kind of elsewhere too. But maybe the pandemic will give a bit of a reset to that culture too, and we'll take it back to the way it used to be, maybe. But
I know, I'm really hoping so.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, cool. So we got one more minute and then we will officially get started. Questions everyone in the chat can enter into the Q&A section. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there will be a Q&A tab you can pop your questions into. And I will just briefly make sure I have everything I want in my notes here. And we'll just wait a couple of minutes still.
And where are you located, Ivy? I forgot, you told me before, but I can't remember.
Yeah, so I'm in Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia. The weather is a rare sunny day. Lately it's been raining because we don't really get like snow here in Vancouver. It rains a lot, like 6 months out of the year. But
yeah, does it rain a lot like it rains a lot in Portland and Seattle? Is it kind of like that?
Very, very similar weather, yeah, because they're just like south of us here. So
got it. Yeah.
Yeah,
sometimes I think about like, what is it going to be like if I relocated back to the States? And, then I think about where, like, oh, would I relocate back to the States and go to Oregon where they decriminalized? Would that be a place to be? And then I was scoping out the, what's it like to live in Portland? And it was, this list of like, the top reasons to live here, the top reasons to not live here. And one of the things it said was it rains all the time. Seasonal afflicted depression is a thing.
Yeah.
I'm just like, and like there's a Portland mist. I'm like, So yeah, it's interesting. I contemplate that too, because there's aspects of US culture that I definitely miss a lot, especially my friends from the Bay Area and folks that are intellectual and psychedelic. There's a lot of this this nice overlap between counterculture, psychedelic culture, and a certain level of intellect that sometimes I don't see very much in the plant medicine community, which is very much more new age. There's not a lot of scientific literacy or media literacy in general, in that it's very intuitive based, a different framework of relating to the world.
Exactly.
And yeah.
exactly. And we have a message from Gina in the chat. It says, come to Berlin. I'd love to come to Berlin as well.
Ah,
Berlin's a cool place.
yeah, I hear really good things about Berlin. I
Yeah,
will make it over there when things calm down. It's always hard to know what the hell's going on here. And like, can you leave? Can you come back? How easy is it? Do I need a test? So it's been just very up in the air, the travel and the borders.
totally, totally. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started now. Nadia, the chat we're referring to is the chat you sent that message in. So just that general chat. But if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button you can also press. So we'll get started here. So I'll give you a bit about myself. My name is Ivy Asterix. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Tantalus Labs. We are a licensed cultivator and processor of cannabis in Canada and British Columbia. I have a bit of interplay with psychedelics as well, do a bit of consulting on regulated substances in general to help guide others through the web really of regulations that you do have to deal with. And I am joined today by the lovely Lorna Liana, who has been nice enough to join us today. And we're going to talk about the keys to decolonizing plant medicine and a little about Lorna. She is the CEO of Entheo Nation, the founder of Plant Spirit School, as well as the creator and host of the Plant Spirit Summit. And I understand we have a few Plant Spirit Summit folks with us today. So thanks for joining us today, Lorna.
Thank you so much for having me here, Ivy. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity and the space to be able to share my thoughts about a very complex and deeply triggering topic.
Awesome, awesome. And I'm just going to pop a link into the chat right now to all panelists and attendees. So this is a free workbook that Lorna has been nice enough to share with us. And through your registration, you'll also be entered into a draw to win, I think, up to 20 free entries into a course that Lorna has. And maybe, Lorna, before we get started, if you just want to mention a bit about what that course is.
Yeah, so the course it's a mini course called How to Microdose Nature. And in this mini course, we cover so what microdosing is, how to get started microdosing, and some of the most popular natural psychedelics that people are microdosing these days. So yeah, it's a really great way to get started. And then it also comes with a masterclass series where we're going to have different experts about the different organic psychedelics speak and share their expertise. So those are going to be live master classes. So yeah,
Awesome.
really glad to have anybody here. The odds are looking really good, by the way. So thank you for showing up.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. That's great, Lorna. So with that, we'll begin here. So why are you passionate about decolonization?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have noticed as somebody who's been in the plant medicine space, I mean, I started, really diving into ayahuasca in 2004. But then prior to 2004, I also did a lot of work with different indigenous communities and, worked on different indigenous rights initiatives. And so one of the things I noticed in the plant medicine space were certain neo-colonial tendencies that were happening, especially with the acceleration of the psychedelic renaissance and the expansion of plant medicines around the world. So one of the things that I've noticed, and also in speaking to a number of the indigenous friends that I've made in my journey, is certain tendencies that are happening that are very similar to the West's co-opting of yoga from the East, where when you think about a yoga instructor or a yogi, what comes to mind? For me, what comes to mind is a beautiful, svelte, white yoga instructor and Instagram celebrity.
Yeah,
Not
definitely.
somebody who is Indian from the subcontinent. And so we're seeing that dynamic happen and accelerate more and more. These days, there are, when you're looking at, for example, the ayahuasca space, there are more non-Indigenous that are consuming ayahuasca and offering ayahuasca in ceremonies than there are Indigenous people consuming and leading consuming ayahuasca and leading ayahuasca ceremonies. So as you see the sector become more developed, more formalized, we're seeing many more psychedelic companies that are being developed. There are many more brand new psychedelic retreat centers and retreat organizations, retreat ventures that are being created. And you start to see these dynamics where the owners of these companies are predominantly white, and they're predominantly white and male. And they're offering these ancestral plant medicines and these healing ceremonies in a way that is quite removed from, in most cases, quite removed from the traditional roots of how these plant medicines were originally consumed. And they're offering these medicines to a demographic of people that are predominantly from the global north. So predominantly white, predominantly North American, affluent, they're willing to pay thousands of dollars. And so we're seeing a creation of an economy that is essentially exclusionary of the indigenous, ignorant of indigenous perspectives. And and many of the people that are in this space, while they are very much committed to healing and transformation, spiritual awakening, many of the white folks in the space do not have any awareness of some of the systemic inequities that continue to impact BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. They are unaware of the continued struggle of that the Indigenous face in many different countries in the world where these plant medicines originate from. And in some cases, in many cases actually, where we have the leaders of these companies and communities who haven't done any anti-racism work personally, they can create harm for other BIPOC folks that participate in their experiences and their retreats and their offerings, because they haven't examine their own privilege, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so when you're creating these healing spaces for people to really become vulnerable and open up, what you see is that many folks of color are healing racial trauma in these spaces. And when you are healing years and maybe generations of racial trauma and oppression, if you're in a space where you cannot speak about your experiences without making other white folks uncomfortable who are sharing that space, let alone like the person that's leading the ceremony, then it becomes re-traumatizing because you're vulnerable, you're healing from this experience. People are lecturing you that it's just a figment of your imagination. There is no race, we are all one. There is no, like, in your past life you were another, we were all different races in our past lives. That doesn't necessarily make things feel better. So BIPOC can experience those types of responses as racial microaggressions, and they can be re-traumatizing. And so one of the main reasons why I'm so passionate about this topic is because my experience with plant medicines has helped me see the depth at which the racial trauma and oppression that I experienced growing up, especially as I grew up in a colony. I grew up in Hong Kong, which was a British colony. So I lived colonialism, and I experienced daily racial harassment from the British classmates that I shared in school. And I didn't understand, what's happening. Why are they, so mean to me? Why are they calling me these names? So my family's from Taiwan, but I was not seen as a Taiwanese person. I was not seen as somebody that was born in the United States. I was seen as another Chinese colonial subject and was treated as such. And the Hong Kongers didn't actually get the right to vote until 1997. And in 1997, the British treaty, it was about a 200-year treaty where they had colonial rule over Hong Kong, and then they were giving Hong Kong back as a territory back to mainland China. So a lot happened in 200 years, right? And so mainland China became communist. So Hong Kong got handed back to China, which was communist China, and that is another form of imperialism where the Hong Kongers would actually probably most likely prefer to be independent. And you see this with the umbrella revolution that's been happening and really accelerated before the pandemic really shut things down. But there were lots of like gigantic protests of people that are protesting the PRC's attempt to change the electoral system that Hong Kong has, that was set up by the British upon leaving. So like the last, couple years of like British rule, they're like, okay, we got to make Hong Kong democratic. And when I was growing up in Hong Kong, there were all these pro-democracy marches with hundreds and thousands of people, millions of people. And so, the British left are like, okay, here's democracy. And then China, now deals with it. So China has done, many measures to erode human rights in Hong Kong and protections for human rights. And so there's been a lot of demonstrations against that. Why I'm so passionate is because I've lived colonialism. I experienced the trauma of racial violence. I deeply longed to be somebody that was not Chinese but white. I thought everything would be better for me if I was a white person. And it was only when I started to work extensively with ayahuasca, and also ayahuasca and psychotherapy in tandem with each other, that I began to unravel the depth of the racial trauma that I experienced and how it really affected how I perceive myself in the world. And yeah, so that's a bit of a long story, but I hope that shares with you my passion for it.
Wonderful, Lorna. No, like I think most of us recall what's been happening in Hong Kong last year in terms of all that political unrest. So like it's really great to bring that perspective to plant medicine, because it's a directly correlated thing. So just a couple things in the chat. We have a hand up from Amalia, and if you want to pop your question into the chat, Amalia, or into Q&A, we will definitely get to it. And Lorna, one thing I forgot to ask is do you want to do questions as they come up, or do you want to save them for the end?
I would love to save them for the end, please.
Okay, yep, for sure. Alrighty, so we will move on then to our next topic, which is actually defining what is decolonization.
Decolonization is the process of restoring a territory back to sovereignty. So it involves the process of having a colonial power, like removing a colonial power and restoring territorial sovereignty. So it's really seen within the lens of colonialism and independence. And in addition to the restoration of the territorial sovereignty and the rights of the colonized people, there is also an increasing recognition for the need to remove the harm or the impact of colonialism in other aspects of life. So when you look at many of the countries, many of the regions of the world that have been colonized, what has happened for the colonized people is their languages were forbidden. Their families were split up. They were moved off their land. There's been so much colonization around the world, it looks differently in different regions, and there are similarities. So the removal of people from their homes, from their land, the separation of children from families, violence, genocide, slavery, indentured servitude. It looks like prohibiting people within the same ethnic group to marry each other in an intentional campaign to to assimilate them within a greater within the greater culture, so to speak. And there is also the imposition of the colonial values upon the colonized peoples. So when you look at the power dynamics in the world from a geopolitical perspective, what you see in the modern era is Western cultural hegemony. So basically, a cultural power structure, so to speak, that has its roots in Western colonial expansion, where everything that's European is considered to be better. European values. So when you look at Western cultures, the rights of the individual are a European value. It's based in, it has its roots in a Western philosophy and political theory. So the rights of the individual over the community, over the collective, you see a valuing of science, of rationality, of logic. These are considered to be superior values. And there's also the superiority, supremacy of Christianity and of the white complexion, so to speak. So the more white and European you looked, and if you're Christian, you were kind of at the top of the echelon, and any peoples that didn't believe in Christianity, that had a different religion, tradition, were darker in color, were considered to be inferior, more animalistic, so to speak. And so the narrative that many of us that have been subjected to living in the West is that the reason why the Western countries are so much more advanced, so much more wealthy, so much more developed, is because reason and science and logic were ultimately superior facets of understanding the world and problem solving and developing. And there is absolutely no recognition of the fact that much of this wealth was actually plundered and was actually a result of theft and murder and genocide and slavery. So these are things that we don't really recognize unless we actually start to look at them. And this is why I think it's important to bring it up, especially for the psychedelic sector and for the plant medicine sector, is because we're seeing these dynamics play out. Because when you look at capitalism, what's underneath capitalism is its colonial foundation. And so you cannot separate capitalism from colonialism. And it's really, it's like you can't separate the capitalism from white supremacy. You can't separate colonialism from white supremacy. They're all very deeply interlinked.
Definitely. Wow, that's a great definition, Lorna. I think even like I just like learned a bunch of things. So thank you very much for that.
And I should also add another really important area of decolonization that's really emerging too. And so this is also this is really coming out of Native American scholarship and academia, where it's like, okay, in addition to removing these oppressive non-physical structures. So there's like the physical system of domination, and then there's the non-physical system. So you've got physical as expressed by laws that favor one group over another, and then the non-physical would be like belief systems, but being indoctrinated to believe that certain qualities and values are superior over others. But then there's another push to say, hey, decolonization really needs to also consider recentering and re-elevating the language, the culture, the belief systems, the practices of the people that were the original people in the area, recognizing that the land that you're on was stolen from another group of people, and to just keep that in top of mind as well. So I think that's also really important to know. And then we start moving into, what does decolonization look like in non-tangible space? And that's where the conversation can get deeply nuanced and very tricky to understand and navigate.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely relate to what you just said about the land being stolen. Here in Canada, we've like made some progress finally, like as performative as the like declarations that we are living on land that was thieved before things like government talks, like performative as that can be, at least it's like something when like previously we had nothing. So
Yeah, it's really a progress. It's a
yeah,
process,
yeah,
progress,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so next, when it comes to being an educator about decolonization, there's all kinds of questions around things like, do you need a degree? Do you need certain certifications? What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so one thing I noticed, especially in the last year in 2020, when you start to see, there's been a real uh, resurgence of the Black Lives Matters movement, as we've seen, triggered by George Floyd, his murder. And when you think about so it's been a lot of push to bring you know awareness around diversity, equity and inclusion to the conversation. And part of that is, many folks that are DEI educators are also addressing topics of decolonization. And so, decolonization in terms of like a formal career track, it's not really so much of a thing, right? There aren't, kind of like degrees that you get in order to become a decolonization professional. So you'll see a wide range of backgrounds where people come from, where, because decolonization is such a big field, right? So there is scholarship, Native American scholarship. There's also scholarship from Africa, because Africa went through, its European conquest phase and independence. And so there's a lot of scholarship coming out of Africa and India. One of the greatest decolonizers was Mahatma Gandhi, so to speak. So I think it's important to understand decolonization from a number of different perspectives, because each people's perspective is different. So I have that perspective of being, somebody that grew up in Hong Kong. I cannot speak to the Native American experience of colonization and the tremendous harm and suffering that they endured and continue to endure as their lands continue to be occupied,
Mhm.
and the intergenerational trauma that they experienced. I cannot speak to the experience of Africans who were colonized in Africa, and the wars that they experienced, and the slavery that they endured as well. Being sent to faraway countries to be slaves elsewhere. There's tremendous trauma in this area. So I've seen approaches coming from historical approaches. I've seen political approaches and political theory perspectives to decolonization. And I've also seen psychological perspectives. So a number of people that are incorporating decolonization in their coaching work might have degrees in counseling and psychology, because there's a lot of internal decolonization that is really important for a lot of folks, especially BIPOC folks, to go through in a transformational journey to feel more whole, so to speak. So it's
Mhm.
really important, when I would say, for a lot of folks who are BIPOC, to examine decolonization from an internalized oppressive framework, that psychological framework as well.
Definitely. And what do you hope to bring? Oh, sorry, what do you hope to bring to the table with your perspective on decolonization? Because I think you have a really unique perspective. So I'm really interested to hear what your response to that would be.
Yeah, so what I would say is, understanding the capitalist dynamics in the plant medicine and psychedelic sector, because colonialism and capitalism are intrinsically entwined. And so one of the things that I noticed is that in this sector, which is increasingly predominantly white, there isn't this understanding of the impact of colonialism on folks that are not white. And so there are certain norms that we're seeing in this space that are being perpetuated because there just never has been any awareness or examination. And a lot of this awareness and examination actually just comes from, formal education, right? So if you never actually had any education around history or politics, if that wasn't your thing, then you might not be aware of, how we continue to see these forces play out in our economy, play out in our society, in our politics. So to bring to the table just some understanding of some of the basic concepts, and then to also, highlight or to bring to the perspective, some of the other folks that are, that I would like to present to my audience as well that have thoughts to share about that. So, for example, I have a mini course about the keys to decolonizing plant medicine culture. And in the mini course, I'm teaching the core concepts and then how to recognize these dynamics in the psychedelic sector and the plant medicine sector. And then the mini course has masterclass teachers who are coming to deliver live masterclasses to share their perspective as an Indigenous person. For example, as a Shipibo master healer in Peru, what would he think about decolonizing ayahuasca tourism? What would that look like for them?
Mhm.
So I think it's just to be able to shine a light on as many voices as possible.
Awesome, awesome. And what do you see as the biggest obstacles to decolonization? Like, I think we've kind of mentioned a couple of them in terms of like the capitalistic kind of influences that are now spreading into what will be the kind of normalized psychedelic medicine. But yeah, like what are the overall obstacles that you see?
Yeah, and so this is where I think also your work comes really interesting too, because I think you're also paying attention to some of the companies that are showing up in this space, right? So, so the whole invasion of Silicon Valley venture tech into the psychedelic space
Yeah.
is something that is I think alarming the many members of the old school psychedelic community. And so in this regard, I love to ask you, Ivy, what do you see?
Yeah, so I mean, like I think one of the biggest obstacles is actually that those people and those technologies can bring a lot of benefit. Like if we could make it so, for example, taking mushrooms didn't cause some people nausea, if we could bring these technological advances in a more responsible way, and like we did not have companies that like lobby for regulations that will basically lock out the like I don't even like to use the word underground because like though like the original cultural practitioners should not be the ones that are referred to as underground because they've been doing this very very responsibly for so long. And so like I think it's really hard to balance because when I think a lot of politicians and a lot of regulators and all that look at this, they think, oh, like someone just like eating mushrooms versus this company says they have this patent in this way to put it into a pill, like you get kind of a little bit of a halo around that approach. Like some people say in cannabis, for example, the CBD halo, if it has CBD, it must be healthy and good. There's other like wellness products that kind of have that kind of halo around it. So like I think the overall problem is that we're more concerned about what those products will bring us and not really how those benefits will be delivered. And like I think what we've seen in cannabis is that there have been a few companies that tried to do it very responsibly, but there have been many who just kind of rushed in and tried to get as much profit as possible, and they kind of rushed out. And a lot of those companies and those people who built those companies are now coming to psychedelics. So I mean, I think the biggest obstacle I see is trying to make it attractive to people to do it responsibly and not just focus on, oh, we're going to have this like awesome pill and it's going to revolutionize mental health, and not really realizing, well, that is going to lock that benefit out to like so many people, even just people who have problems navigating the like regular medical system, people of color, trans people, other people in the LGBTQ spectrum. There's all these kind of hidden thorny things to navigate, and I think like a lot of these like technological stuff, what like Silicon Valley advertises is just too shiny that people will get like totally drawn to that and kind of miss these like other issues. So
Yeah, there's so many different layers to unpack in what you just said, but one of the things that I would like to comment on is that the psychedelic gold rush is so much like the cannabis gold rush, where we
oh,
have a
great.
sector that is basically becoming quickly becoming decriminalized and becoming legalized, right? And so with the cannabis sector, many of the folks that actually made cannabis a thing were people of color. They were Black cultural icons, so to speak, that made the whole appreciation of different strains of cannabis kind of part of the counterculture. And many of the producers were people of color that actually, and the distributors in this ecosystem when it was underground were people of color, and they were imprisoned for being the first movers in this industry, right? And
Exactly.
so then now you have an industry that's like legalized or criminalized, and we're not seeing necessarily any type of restorative justice. So some of the folks that were the dealers and the growers are still in jail, and
Mhm.
there's okay, there's like some initiatives like in Oakland, I believe there's some grants that you can get if you were formerly incarcerated. You could be, released and then have a grant or to be a cannabis entrepreneur. But that's not really happening in other places too. And then the people that are actually coming into the space and dominating it are folks that are predominantly white male who have a lot of cash behind them. They have the lawyers, they're able to pay the lawyers that can navigate all the really complicated certification and legislation, the certification process to be compliant. So many of the small growers that I know in California, they just had to fold because they couldn't deal with all the paperwork. It was so
Yeah.
expensive. They couldn't pay the $50,000 to like get a professional. They just couldn't compete. And so then you have these companies run by folks that can raise a bunch of money, and the big businesses moving in, the Philip Morrises and
Mhm.
Marlboros of the world, trying to plant a stake in cannabis. And we're seeing a similar dynamic with psychedelics too, where yeah, it's an industry that's developing where the predominant benefits of the the purported benefits, the recipients of the purported benefits are predominantly white and affluent, and the recipients of the beneficiaries of the um, profits generated in the venture and the sector are predominantly white.
Mhm.
And many of these medicines were brown people's medicines. So there isn't much equity or justice in it. And
Exactly.
so the key question is, what can we do to begin dismantling this environment? Because it's all taking place within the container of capitalism. So I understand that like everybody is trying to play by these rules, right? And the rules are set up in a certain way.
Yeah.
And the rules are set up to favor those companies that can go to market most quickly, to seize market share, and to launch a minimal viable product. So when you launch a minimal viable product and seize market share using ready, fire, aim tactics, you're not taking the time to consult other folks that might want, deserve to be consulted in your strategic plan. And there isn't much thought about serving an underserved market because they don't have the money to pay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it just reinforces the same old colonial dynamics that we know this already. So
Mhm.
how do we change it, especially since the purported benefits of psychedelics is to help us feel all interconnected, like we are all one?
Yeah. 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 Totally. And by the way, I might just thieve ready, fire, aim from you. That is a great, a great saying. And it's the first time I've heard it. So that is so amazing.
Yes, one of the biggest obstacles, like going back to your question, one of the
Yeah,
biggest obstacles is the cash. You know, who has the
yeah,
cash and who doesn't have the cash. Like who has the cash has got more of the chips to win this game.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, I mean, that kind of brings us actually to our last question in terms of like, what can people do to dismantle those legacies and those influences of like colonialism, capitalism, and make the sector more diverse, equitable, and inclusive?
Yeah, so one of the other things that I also see within the sector that's like a real obstacle is, well, let's see. So it's kind of like a twofold thing. So I would say the first thing is to start to be aware and to engage in your own personal anti-racism training and to explore what privilege looks like, and just to be aware of these dynamics. So the self-awareness, the decolonization of yourself is going to be an important step, and to do so in a way that's like non-judgmental of yourself. This is internal work, right? So don't punish yourself with shame, blame, and make wrong for having been indoctrinated in this way, because we've all been indoctrinated in this way. And to have compassion for yourself while educating yourself, and to recognize that it is an ongoing process of recognizing all the ways in which we've been colonized. So that's the first aspect. And once you start to become aware, then you can become more capable of taking action in whatever way that you can. So, for some folks, those actions means being more aware of privilege and being more aware of the very different experience of other people in the planet by virtue of the way that they look, and to be more empathic and to listen more, and to not argue with a person of color for speaking their truth of their lived experience of discrimination. The whole like lecturing aspect of that comes with white supremacy. One of the aspects that I often see that is a expression of white supremacy is the idea that one has the right to dominate um, other people's spaces and to be in all spaces at all times. And this starts to raise the question of, how does one decolonize non-tangible spaces? So to give you an example, what I'm seeing right now is the push to grab market share in the psychedelic sector is giving rise to more and more websites and companies that are pumping out content about psychedelics.
Yeah.
I keep discovering yet another website, and I look at the about page, and I'm like, wow, they definitely got a lot of money to have this staff of to pump out like all these SEO articles about psilocybin. It's like all the same, right? It's all the same keywords. So I see
Yeah.
this. Yeah, I'm an internet marketer by a profession, so it's like, wow, yet another well-funded cannabis investor company is starting to seize the digital space for psychedelics, right? So there's this expansion, and then the question is, okay, do they have the right to do that? It's hard to say, right? Because the digital technology is an invention of the West and Western science. Is it a cultural appropriation to write about a plant or a fungus when you're talking about the pharmacology of it, and that is a Western discipline? The science is a Western discipline. um, you know if you use your platform to elevate indigenous perspectives and to talk about some of the cultural issues and the challenges, is that appropriation or is that giving back? And Yeah, so there are so many questions around this aspect of, domination of non-tangible spaces. But one thing that could, be an easy thing to, step back from is the right to dominate somebody else's space, like somebody else's social media, for example. One of the things that I see often is, in the conversation about racial equity and systemic injustice, some of the folks that are the most intrusive in other people's social media spaces, especially people of color, are white folks that are lecturing the other the person of color that, yeah, the systemic racism doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so when you start to educate yourself about the experience of other folks on the planet, then it becomes easier to listen. It becomes easier to not have to win the argument. And so that already, is just like a big improvement right there. And then if you can exert some influence in your community, in your business, to look at ways in which you can increase the diversity of your community, increase the diversity of your company, make your spaces feel much more safe for BIPOC. Look at ways in which you can create payment options that are more inclusive of folks that do not have the resources to pay what, the more affluent demographic can pay. And I see this a lot with ceremonies,
Mhm.
ceremonies that are thousands of dollars. One of the ways that I'm seeing retreat centers and ceremony and retreat companies address this is to create scholarship funds, so that if there's a worthy person of color that cannot pay the $2,000 or $5,000 retreat fee, to that somebody else who's more abundant can, can contribute to the scholarship fund, or that there could be a discount and a scholarship application that's offered. Um, and I think too, what I see a lot, which can be a real obstacle, is there's a lot of infighting in the psychedelic community. And when there's this infighting among parties, individuals, organizations that actually are all fundamentally doing their work for a very similar reason, but
Yeah.
in their different way, like, then what happens is that this infighting erodes the collective, and the powers that win are those colonial powers that have all the cash, right? So I see often a lot of infighting coming from reactive allies that, are trying to take down other people in the space for, like, you know, weaponizing decolonization, weaponizing
Yeah.
cultural appropriation. And so what happens for a lot of folks who are activists, and this happens, not just in the psychedelic space, but in many, many activist spaces
Yeah.
where, the activists are, trying to fight the, dismantle the oppression from above. And below them are other folks like tearing them down for not doing the work in the way that they think they should be doing. Or, so there's different people have different ideas about what decolonization means, and what reciprocity means, and what cultural appropriation is, right? And so to understand that these topics are deeply nuanced. And um so the attacking other folks for not doing reciprocity the way that you think ought to be done is fundamentally undermining uh the solidarity movement, so to speak, because
Mhm.
activist fatigue is a real thing.
I can
Activist
attest to
burnout.
it being a very
Like
real
you're
thing
you're
for
damned
sure.
if you do, and you're damned if you don't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Wow, wonderful, Lorna. This has been really great. So I have a couple of questions, and one of them is how to keep in touch with you. So what I'm going to do is once again drop the link to your free workbook in the chat here. If you want to also tell us, yeah, like where people can get in touch with you, maybe some of the work that you do, so they can. And this question is from Nancy Luna, and she asks, how can we keep in touch with Lorna to learn more and help make an active change?
Yeah, so if you sign up for the workbook, then you're automatically added to my email list. You can also email me directly at lorna@entheonation.com. I will just drop it into the group. Yeah, and feel free to reach out, get in touch, join the email list, and looking forward to connecting.
Amazing, thank you. So our first question is from Chris Farrell, and he says, with a proper baseline, is it possible for Westerners to legit adopt their own spiritual principles around the medicines without hindering this cause? Obviously, you just do it, but going deeper, I find so much muddle. So like, I think that that question is I'm kind of asking, like, can Westerners kind of create their own frameworks around like using psychedelics and that kind of thing without kind of hindering the work of decolonization?
You know, this is a very interesting topic, and different people will have different opinions about this, right? So the whole question of using ethnobotanical medicine, so to speak, humans have been trading medicines and agricultural produce and goods since the dawn of humanity, essentially. So when you think about how plants are shared across cultures, we don't necessarily think that we are appropriating from Ethiopians when we drink a cup of coffee every morning. We don't think, if we're consuming cannabis, that we are appropriating from Central Asians and creating harm for them. So it's really tricky, the question of, is a person who is not from the culture of the spiritual culture of that medicine creating harm by consuming that medicine and incorporating their own practices. This is highly debatable. There's strong opinions and arguments either way. What I can say is that culture is always changing. So one of the things that you can observe in the Amazon, especially, so I know Amazonian culture way better than some of the other medicine cultures. I know next to nothing about iboga, very little about peyote. So, what I see in Amazonian cultures and in the communities that I've visited over time is that the culture is changing. And you'll see, even within the indigenous communities, there's arguments about how the ceremony ought to be conducted, because back then, in the time of their grandparents, it was only they would drink the medicine and chant their sacred songs. And then these days, the new generation of indigenous pages are, and this is like in the Brazilian side, that I know I'm more familiar with. The indigenous pages in the Brazilian side are um, changing the chants and turning them into songs and playing um, music, playing guitar. And that's a totally new thing, innovation, so to speak. And so then there's the question of, okay, culture's always changing, and you're seeing that groups of, I mean, it's just like this continuum of a timeline, right? So if you go to any area, you'll find that some of the practices are fundamentally different than they are now, or fundamentally different from 20 years ago than they are now. So I don't know if that really answers your question, so to speak. There are some folks, I've interviewed a number of thought leaders in the space as to whether or not Western consumers of ayahuasca owe any reciprocity to the indigenous. And when I interviewed Chris Killam, the medicine hunter, he's like, come on, no. I mean, are you going to send $5 to Peru anytime you have French fries? Are you going to send $5 to Ethiopia anytime you have a cup of coffee? So that was one perspective. Now, Jeremy Narby had a different perspective. He was like, absolutely. Even if the ayahuasca ceremony facilitator is non-indigenous and pouring ayahuasca that was sourced in Hawaii and holding a ceremony space that has absolutely nothing to do with any cultural practice or any sacred form or altar that was passed on, if they just kind of are doing it their way, do they owe any reciprocity? He thought yes, because it was the indigenous that shared their medicine with the Western world and this way of consuming the medicine in a ceremonial format or structure. So absolutely that ceremony facilitator who's non-Indigenous and from Hawaii should offer some reciprocity. So you'll get different perspectives. And I
Mhm.
think ultimately at the end of the day, just, think about the dynamic and just recognize there is this growing industry. There is a lot of money to be made in this industry. There's a lot of money being made in this industry. Most of the people that are making the money are non-Indigenous. Most of the people are white. Most are male. And the Indigenous, who were the original wisdom keepers, are increasingly shut out of this industry, especially if certifications start getting implemented.
Yeah.
An Indigenous shaman's not going to go through a certification program that's designed for a Western psychotherapist or Western psychologist that has an academic background in psychology or counseling. They're not going to ever pass that, or master the language of pharmacology. So they won't get certification. So when you think about that, just think, how does that feel fair? And if it doesn't feel fair to you deep in your heart, what can you do to make some change,
Mhm.
baby steps, because as you become more empowered to make these changes, your impact will be bigger and bigger.
Definitely. And when I moderated a past panel for MAPS, we had Dr. Will Sue as part of a panel on the social challenges of the movement. And he brought up something really interesting because I kind of asked this question. And he said, well, some of these groups and some of these cultures don't want to bring more capitalism into their communities. So, when we talk about, what is like owed to them and what should we do, like our like first instinct to kind of center on our own systems, which is capitalism. Like if I provide something of like value because I like grew up in the West and I grew up under capitalism, my first request would be, well, yeah, I'd like a service, I'd like some money for that. And he brought up a really good point that like you really have to consider these communities and as not a big monolith. One of them might want some like Western company to come in and like donate or whatever, but one of the other ones might not want that. So like I think it's really important to not center us when we talk about these things and center like the actual communities that are impacted in terms of
Absolutely. I mean, I think, language is tricky, right? So we do
yeah.
need to use words that generalize to describe a thing, right? But yes, there are very Indigenous communities can be very different, even the same area, different language, different culture, different approach. And it's important to recognize their sovereignty to make decisions to move their communities forward in the way that they see best fit. And so there are some communities that are inviting with intention, inviting outsiders to come to their village for, in specific times where they have a festival where they're going to be prepared to receive those outsiders. And then beyond that, like nobody's allowed.
Yeah.
There are others that are partnering with NGOs because they want to receive support and to cultivate allyship with other organizations outside in the international sphere. In many regards, most of the financial resources for a lot of these communities don't come from within their own countries. They come from people in the global north. And so
Exactly.
that's why it's important to them to be able to, create these alliances.
hmm Totally. We have some very good comments from Nadia in the chat too, who says, as a woman of color, I so appreciate your voice in this space. It is really refreshing. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, Lorna. So we
Oh,
have some fans in the
you.
chat. So we might have already answered this a little bit, but maybe just to put a point on it. Question from Marlon, who says, what do reparations look like in psychedelic policy?
Gosh, that's a really big question, and I think there's so many different facets to consider. There's reparations to those who have been incarcerated, for substances that are now decriminalized or legal. That's a really big one. There's reparations for colonialism and to the indigenous, and what could that look like. I think also, I mean, it's so tricky, right? I mean, it, even there's different understandings of what that looks like to different people, even within the same communities, right? So how do you decide, is it reparations enough to give to an NGO, right? And hope that some of the money that you give to that NGO makes it to the communities that you want? Or do you want to give directly to the community? But if you give directly to a community in the spirit of reciprocity, then you got to understand, like, that person that is receiving the money, are they really going to share it with their community, or are they going to go buy a boat and a cow? I mean, that those things happen a lot too. So it's not, I think it's important, as an individual, it's important to understand, to discern within yourself, like, what relationships do you have and what causes you feel most aligned with, because that's going to determine, where you might feel like you want to contribute in the spirit of reciprocity. When it comes to reparations, I think reparations is something where I see that much more at a governmental level, right? So governmental harm, or possibly, like, if a business is harming another community, like an extractive industry in the Amazon that has polluted the drinking water because they spilled all this oil, does that company owe reparations? Now, the tricky thing is, a lot of these companies will not pay reparations because that would be admitting guilt. And we see with the Chevron Texaco oil spill in Ecuador, that was the biggest oil spill in history, and it was the biggest lawsuit against a company on behalf of an entire community of people. And Chevron has not paid that. They were
Right.
fined a really large amount of money. I can't even, $1 billion maybe. Don't quote me on that. You can look it up, but they've not paid the fine. And the tragic thing is, the lawyer that defended the indigenous peoples in that case has been harassed by Chevron legal team, and is currently under house arrest with some type of, like, device around his ankle. So this is the
Yeah.
thing, right? It's just, yeah. So reparations, should reparation come from government? Will government actually acknowledge the need for reparations?
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Well, once again, Lorna, thanks so much. We do have another question in the chat, but Daniel is also here to remind us that we need to end at 12:30. So he's dropped a link in the chat to the kind of after talk discussion area, Lorna. So I don't know if you have a little bit more time maybe to answer a couple more questions at that link.
Yeah, totally. Just let me know when I gotta shut up, and just, yeah,
Okay.
you tell me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so Daniel has dropped the link in the chat, Lorna, if you maybe want to check that out. It's www.ozzo.events/tamjam.
Oh, okay, the Ozo room. Okay, now I'm okay, sure.
Yeah,
So, let's see. So yeah, so I gotta click on that and then leave.
yeah. So we'll just
I will click on that.
okay, cool. So we'll just end it here really quick and say thanks to everyone who joined us, and thanks to Lorna and Daniel for putting on all of today's events. So yeah, I haven't used Oslo before, so we will see how that works. But yeah, we will see you there, Lorna.
All right, cool. I'm going there. Ciao, ciao. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later.